Welcome to the very first episode of the Believe in Serverless podcast. Last week, I asked you guys a question in Discord, on Twitter, and on LinkedIn. What do you want to see out of this community? And about 25% of you said podcast. So guess what? Here we are. So James and I are here with you today to summarize what's going on in the community. We're going to talk about what you guys talked about. We're going to talk about the sessions that happened last week. And of course, we're going to be talking about what's going on next week and what's going on in the future, so everybody knows what's going on. But this is your weekly wrap up. We're going to be doing this every week, and we are going to be juggling hosts. So there are 5 community champions in the Believe in Serverless community: myself, James, Andres Moreno, Danielle Heberling, and Ben Pyle. So based on our availability, 2 of the 5 of us pretty much every week are going to be in here talking to you about you. So I'm excited to be here. James, welcome. Happy to have you here with me.
I'm also extremely excited to be here and doing this for the first episode. Talking to you about you. I kind of like that. I kind of like that as a tagline. I should make that the tagline.
I like that too. It just came to me.
In the moment.
It does, yes. And so, this is the first episode, and with the first anything of anything, we're winging it, and we're going to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And so this is probably going to be a really informal episode, which, that tends to be my style anyway, is informal and off the cuff. We generally have the best conversations when we do things like that. But this format is likely to change over time, which is fine. And we'll figure out what you guys like. As always, community feedback is the best way for us to improve and for you to tell us what you like and what you don't like. So please let us know at the end of this episode. Did you like it? Did you not? And we'll adjust. So before we get started, let's first thank our sponsor. Our sponsor for this episode is Momento. Momento had a really big week last week. They announced the general availability of Topics, the real-time messaging service. They announced the upgrade from just a singular caching service to an entire platform, a serverless infrastructure platform with caching, event messaging, and soon to be storage as well. And then they also announced a Series A funding of $15 million. Super exciting. Actually, if you don't know, I am a part of that team. I'm on leave right now, but I am very, very happy to be a part of that team and very excited. So congratulations to the entire team. I am very excited to see where we go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such an impressive product. Like on my live stream last week, I added Memento to a Spring Boot Java application. Java application to a Postgres database, and the average latency, I think, was about 600 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds. And then I added Memento, and the graph of the latency looked like it had gone to 0. The change was so noticeable. I was like, wait, what? What's happened to my latency? It was like consistent double-digit millisecond latency from like 600, 700 milliseconds. Now, granted, this is a Java application connecting to a Postgres database, so it's not the most performance of starting points, but it just shows. And it was so easy, super easy. Like I think it was like 10 lines of code or 15 lines of code or something like that to add Memento. So it's super, incredibly well deserved.
I said we were going to talk about you, so let's first welcome the new members. This week, we had 5 new members join us. And I only have their usernames. I don't have what their actual names are, so I'll just welcome the usernames, which is really weird for me. I'm not really a gamer, so I'm not used to talking about people by their usernames. So we're just going to say it. So welcome Mahmood, Bees with 3 E's and a Z, Headless Browser, Ashley, and Calvin Tora. Welcome to the community. I am looking forward to learning from all of you. And Ashley, we actually had a really good conversation with Ashley this week. Ashley Peacock. He came in. He wrote a book that apparently you've read before.
It's
James.
A fantastic book as well. So it's a book on serverless development with Cloudflare workers. It's really practical. It's the kind of book that I like reading where you work through building like something practical, like a real application using all of the Cloudflare services. So the key value store, the database, the actual workers themselves, the storage. A really practical book, really good, highly recommended. And it's awesome to have Ashley in the community actually, because to have these other serverless offerings that exist out there in the world, talking to us as well. Like you say, it was a fantastic conversation, like straight off the bat, just talking about workers and all the kind of things you can do with Cloudflare. So I'm excited to see what Ashley can help, as well as the other four as well, of course.
Yeah, I'm really excited about having somebody in there to talk about Cloudflare because I'm not actually sure I've had one conversation with somebody about Cloudflare where the word magic wasn't said at least once.
Yeah.
Apparently, like the global availability of everything, just how things work, how things are injected, it just feels like magic. Apparently,
Yeah.
nobody does it quite like they do.
Yeah, and there's some really cool, like some of the features of it. So there's a thing I don't know if it's in Ashley's book or maybe on the Cloudflare blogs. I can't remember where exactly I read this, but imagine you've got like a database. Let's imagine your database is in AWS in EUS1, and you've got your application deployed to workers. Cloudflare will automatically work out if they're better putting your application closer to the users, or are they better putting your application in close to EUS1, and your users, and they'll actually work out on the fly what's the best latency, and they'll just shift your application. Like, wait, what? What? I've heard one of the PMs say like their region is the world. Like they'll just shift things around. But it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Like when we talk about and think about serverless and the less and less things that us as developers have to care about, one of them things is which region do I choose? Like, why should we have to choose a region as developers? Like, why can the cloud provider not just pick the region for us based on where our users are connecting from? So it's a really, really cool service. Like I said, magic. I would say it's just super cool. It's really impressive. Really good developer tooling. I love it.
That's great. And based on what you're saying and what Ashley was talking about last week, I feel like I need to start trying it and actually giving it a shot. I'm excited for that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the community highlights, some of the conversations that went on last week, because we had a really good conversation primarily in the event-driven channel inside of the community Discord. And I know this is really your wheelhouse, James. I think every time there's a conversation in there, you're chiming in. But one of the conversations that was being had in there was talking about public events versus private events. And I don't think everybody understands that concept, especially when you're first getting into event-driven architectures in general. Why don't you talk about like what is the difference? What is a public event versus a private event, and why should you consider them separately?
So whenever I think about these kind of conversations, I always think about a quote from Gregor Hoppe, which is around coupling, which is the appropriate level of coupling depends on the level of control you have over the endpoints. I don't even need to ad-lib that now. Like I've said it so many times, it just comes out. So the difference between public and private events. So if let's say your team is responsible for, I don't know, 4 microservices. And them 4 microservices are communicating with events. So you control all of them services, you control the release cycles, you control the SLAs, you control all of that stuff. So the events that you pass between, it doesn't really matter if you're really tightly coupled at that level because you control it. You can work with everything. So if you need to make a breaking change, it's nice and easy because you make the breaking change and you can kind of release 2 services in lockstep because you control both services. Now, when you start integrating with something outside of your control, you might still be using events. You might still be using the same event message broker. You might be using Event Bridge in both places. But now somebody's consuming your event and you have no idea what they're doing with it. You have no idea what their release cycles look like. You have no idea what their backlog looks like. So that would be a public event because now people are using that and you don't know what they're doing with it, which means you need to be really careful with when you make breaking changes. So when you're building an event-driven system, really, you should be really clear about distinguishing between public and private events because you want to be okay, these are private events. These are for our team. We can make breaking changes. We know where they're being used, and we're never going to expose them to another service. And if you start, and the discussion in Discord was around the mess you can get into if you start exposing them private events public, because then you lose your ability to be able to quickly make changes.
So what was the outcome on that? Like, do people just say, just don't ever do that? If you run into a situation where you need to expose that private event publicly, do they just say, just make a copy of that's public?
Yeah, so the way I would typically do it, I mean, the trade-off being is that you introduce more moving parts. So how I would typically do that is I would have, let's say you publish your private event to some kind of message channel that's consumed, and then one of your consumers of that private message channel would simply just be like a translation layer. And it might initially just do a exact duplicate and then publish it onto another channel. But because you've now put that layer in the middle, it then allows them two events to diverge. And that middle bit can act as kind of like an anti-corruption layer, or just like a translation layer, if you will, where it can take an event in. So then you make a breaking change to your private event. You can then also deploy a change to that translation layer to make sure that breaking change is translated to something that's non-breaking, potentially. But like I said, the trade-off is then you kind of introduce this other bit, this other thing that you then need to manage and deploy and operate. I think most people starting out would just publish it, like not distinguish, and that might be fine initially, but eventually it's going to get hard. Don't do it.
Mo pieces, mo problems, they say. That's
Exactly.
always been.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So, I mean, everything's trade off, isn't it, right? Like, we say it so many times, but it is like introduce complexity, like application topology complexity, I suppose, with the trade off being that you can then evolve your system more easily because you don't need to worry about what the people are doing with your events. So, where do you want the complexity? It's going to be somewhere.
And that's like one of the main parts or benefits of event-driven architectures in my mind, is that those publishers shouldn't, I mean, maybe use exceptions to every rule, right? But shouldn't really care what those consumers are doing in many situations. I can just publish my events and the consumers are responsible really for the downstream side. You know, obviously you should be responsible and not promote breaking changes whenever you want. But that's the nice part about a decoupling, right? Is the producers don't have to know about the consumers. They went really deep in the event-driven talk last week inside of the Discord community. Because another one of the topics they were talking about is ordering, event ordering, which is it's probably one of the harder things in event-driven architecture. It's like, what do you do in situations like that? Now, I have a story to talk about, but I'm actually interested in your opinion, James. Like, is there an easy way to do event ordering?
No, it's hard. It's really, 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 really hard. I think how I would typically approach it is obviously try and avoid it at all costs where it's all possible. The simple solution is to just have a different type of message channel for the thing, because typically like, everything you do isn't going to need to be ordered. It'll be a certain bit. So maybe you use a message channel that's ordered for some bits of your system and a message channel that isn't ordered for other bits of your system. That can be another approach. Or you can get into things around like expiry time. So you've got expiry on your events, or you can put there's an enterprise integration pattern, the resequencer pattern, where at the other side, at the consumer side, you know that you're going to be expecting 5 events related to the same order. And then you wait at the consumer side till you've received 5 for the same order, and then you can resequence them that side. But yeah, there's not an easy solution that I'm aware of, but I'm super interested to hear your story about, maybe your stories can answer all the questions and we can all forget about ordering forever.
Nope. It was no. It was a practical implementation of the resequencer pattern.
Oh, nice.
I was responsible for the application that published events. It was a warrant application, like for a warrant for your arrest. And we would publish events on different stages of the life cycle of a warrant. Like a police officer started a new warrant, a judge was starting to work on it, and judge signed it. It was put into law, it was acted on, and it was done. Basically, those were the life cycle events. And so we had an integration layer basically that communicated with our other applications in our enterprise framework that picked up on those events and would push them in order. Because sometimes, based on the specific type of warrant or like a specific workflow that a jurisdiction would do, the events would come in at the same time. Basically, they would like skip a step and you would say, okay, well, we'll go from here to this step. We'd always publish the same events, but they didn't always make it in the same order. So this integration layer knew about the life cycle of a warrant, and it would consolidate all of them and then resequence them and push them in the order. And it was hard. Like we got tickets written up all the time because an event was missing or an event took too long to get delivered. And as a publisher, that felt like a concern that I didn't need to be a part of. That felt like a consumer thing. And so we'd always like butt heads. It's like, is this a me or you problem? And thinking about how that scales inside of an enterprise was really difficult. And my conclusion on that was what you said at the very beginning. If you can avoid it, don't figure out figure out what you can do to not rely on that ordering. How do you do compensating actions if something's missing or comes in out?
Yeah. Because I think that like if you really like even that scenario you just described, right? If you know that these set of things have got to happen, if an event, let's say you've got event 1, 2, and 3, if event 3 arrives before event 2, how important is that? Because you know that the third thing's happened, so is the second thing really relevant? Like that's how they're the questions I would start to ask as someone like designing that kind of system. And it maybe seems like in your case that you need to know that all of the things have happened, I guess, for some kind of like audit trail or something like that. Like you need to know that the judge has signed something before someone's been arrested. I guess.
Yeah, like it was an integration between the warrant system and the court system. So like based on the different life cycle of a warrant, it would create and update court cases. So like if a warrant becomes law, like becomes active, we would go ahead and preemptively create the court case for it because somebody's getting arrested and somebody's going to go to jail.
Yeah.
And then, you know, when the warrant was actually served, when they actually picked up the person, you would activate that court case. So if you tried to serve it before the court case was created, that's doesn't work because court case doesn't exist.
And I suppose if all that happened and the judge had never signed it because the event never made it, that would probably, I'd imagine, would cause some trouble in the actual legitimacy of that arrest, because if the judge has never signed it as far as the event.
Yes, there's legitimacy of it, and you know a lot of courts also get paid per case. Like there's financials that are involved. It was a really big deal. It actually did matter a lot in this case, but you know, it was important.
This probably actually leads really nicely onto the third topic of conversation in the event-driven Discord this week. Like, it was a very popular channel this week. I mean, it seems to be quite a popular channel anyway, the event-driven one, actually. I think maybe there's a lot of parallels there with serverless systems, but there was also quite a bit of conversation about the outbox pattern. And the outbox pattern, that it should always be an internal concern inside a service that you've got an outbox. And I suppose for anybody who's not familiar, the idea of an outbox pattern is that imagine you need to persist some state in a database and then publish an event that something's changed. Instead of persisting and then publishing, when you persist, you'll also write to what would typically be like an outbox table in your database. And then you can wrap all of that in a transaction. So you know that the event has been saved in the database, ready to be published, and your state has been persisted. And then you'd have a separate process monitoring that outbox table, picking events off and publishing events. Now, I think this is interesting for ordering when you're using things. Let's talk about the DynamoDB streams as an example, because you can write to DynamoDB streams, and that you writing your state is also kind of an outbox if you enable DynamoDB streams, because that every change in your database is going onto a stream that you can then hook into. So if we think about this exact same use case, I suppose, that you had, Alan, that if you were to write all these changes in state to Dynamo, and they're going to come out in a stream in the order that they were written, which means you can then hook into that stream and then publish them externally in the order they were written to Dynamo. And if something wasn't published, it would stay. If it failed, then you'd get stuck at that point in the stream, if you will.
We did do that.
Okay, you did do that. Okay.
Yeah, but like, now it could have been our specific implementation, because what we did was we opted not to wait for batches. Like that's one of the things that you can do with DynamoDB streams is you can say trigger it on X number of messages, or wait this long after the first one. So it's like give me a batch of 30, or wait for a minute after the first one came in and just send me everything after that minute. And because we were trying to keep that latency down between integrating systems, we just always had batch size of 1, which ended up in the same sequencing problems that we had before.
Yeah.
Trade-offs.
Trade-offs, always trade-offs. And I think the most important thing, I think, and that came out of the chat in the community, is that you should never expose whatever that outbox is, the DynamoDB stream in this example. You would never expose the stream directly you wouldn't let an external consumer subscribe directly to the stream, because then you're kind of back into this public event, private event problem, because then you've got people subscribing directly to the structure of the state in your database. So you'd always put another layer between. I wonder if like an SQS FIFO queue stuck onto your DynamoDB stream could help you. Maybe. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't work there anymore, so it's not my problem anymore. Definitely, there were definitely multiple ways to implement what we did.
Absolutely.
Okay, so great conversation in the event-driven channel this week. Loved it. Let's go to unanswered questions. So one of the things that James, you and I would like to accomplish as a result of this podcast is answer any questions that were asked in the Discord community that just were bypassed. Maybe somebody asked 2 questions and one of them were answered. Let's just leave no question left behind. And really there was just one last week that I saw throughout the community channels, and it was from Tico, I believe. And he asked, where's the best place to look at EDA security best practices and things to look out for when implementing EDA? And since you're the EDA expert, it's great that we're here. So do you have an answer for Tico? It's like, is there a good resource for security around EDA, and what best practices do you recommend?
Not that I'm aware of. And I think I actually responded in real time saying, this gives me an idea for a video. Because I don't know of any. I don't know of any existing resources. There's probably something in the AWS documentation somewhere, I would imagine. So the short answer to the question is, I don't know. The more longer-winded answer to that question, in terms of what best practices actually are, is I think there's a few different strategies. Probably the 2 I see the most often. Can I say 3? 3 I don't see the most often. Number 1 is don't include anything sensitive in your events. Don't include any PII, any information you wouldn't want anyone to see. That's obviously not always a practical thing to do because people are going to need that data. So the second approach you can take is to almost split out your events into separate message channels or separate buses. So you might have a bus or a channel that anybody can subscribe to that's open to your entire organization. Not anybody, don't expose it publicly, people. Or have a second bus that you really tightly control who can subscribe to events on that bus, and then you can send all your more secure or PII events or whatever that might be through that. And the third approach I see is using encryption. So encrypting parts of your event and then only giving certain downstream services permissions to be able to decrypt the data in that event. So access the key to be able to decrypt them. And that way you've got one event bus. I think that's arguably the simplest approach, in that you've just got one event bus and anyone can subscribe to, and then there's certain pieces of information that they just can't access. And I think Marcin, who has talked actually on Bleeding Serverless, he's a principal engineer at Ryanair, who are an airline, really big airline in Europe. Not sure they're really an American airline. I don't think Ryanair.
Nope.
The perfect budget airline. Like is it Delta? Is that maybe the comparable one in the US?
Spirit and Frontier.
Spirit. I've never heard of Spirit. There we go. Yeah, and that's what they do internally. They have a combination of separate buses and also use encryption on certain pieces of event data. Yeah. Have you ever had to deal with that? I imagine the use case you were just talking about, that must have had some security requirements, right?
Yeah. What we ended up doing for security around EDA in that standpoint is all the internal eventing. We built this on AWS. So it was more or less what you were talking about with that private versus public event bus, except we were using different event messaging services. So all the internal events, we were using EventBridge, and all of the outbound events, we were using SNS.
Nice. Like it.
So I feel like I should bring this up when we're talking about security with event-driven architectures, but I don't want to get into it for too long, because we're already pretty far into this episode. It's the concept of thin events versus thick events. I know we had a heated discussion on this probably about a month ago in Discord, but it's worth mentioning, at least at a cursory level, when you're talking about security. And I'm actually just going to hand it back over to you with thin events versus thick events. I don't think we actually agreed on this one when we were talking and having our debate.
I think I've disagreed with myself more times than I've disagreed with anybody else. Like I've honestly flip-flop on this so much. Some days I'm like, yeah, everything should be thin. And then the next day I'm like, but you should if everything was fat. The general idea, I suppose, for anyone listening is that a thinner event, you are sometimes known as a notification event. You don't really include any data in the event that you publish. So the event might just say, this is an order confirmed event. The order ID is 1234556, and that's it. And if a consumer needs any more information, they're typically going to have to call back, reach back into the producing system to get more data, which can also be a way of doing security. You can then authorize an API to call back with. The alternate approach, and where security I think becomes more relevant, is if you've got fatter events where you're actually passing order information in this example as part of the event that you publish. So you might include the customer data, the delivery address, the payment information. Don't include payment information in your events. But you could do if you wanted to. And then if you're a downstream consumer, you don't need to call back. You've got all the information that you need right there. I'm, at the minute, more of a fan of thinner events. But again, maybe last time we spoke, I was a fan of fatter events. Like this does vary almost week to week. Like I go back and forth all the time. What are your thoughts on it?
Yep.
Not to get too deep into it, as I said, but
with all the production event-driven architecture I've done, it was all government. It was all PII. It was all criminal justice information. So it was all thin events. So we would do exactly what you said. We would say the warrant is active or a warrant is approved. That would be the event type. And then the only thing that we would have in there is the warrant ID. And then we would rely on people calling back to fetch that data, just because we can't, like legally can't do that. We can't send things out. It's just too much of a risk that it's leaving the Gov Cloud and and all that stuff. Now, where I go on the fence is, I tend to do what Stripe does. Stripe's a fantastic service to model pretty much anything after, and all of their events are thick events, like everything on there. I don't think it has credit card number, but it has all of most of the payment information, like the specific charges, everything, all contained in their events. So I tend to say, well, if Stripe does it, it's probably fine, unless you have, unless you have some, legal requirements, like I did in my last job.
Yep.
Okay, so I got to steer us away from this conversation. I'm sure we could go for an hour on this. And let's talk about the live streams that happened last week. We had 2 streams last week. We had Sam Locke talk about I am. Do you say IAM or I am?
I am. I think
I am.
I'd say I am. Yeah, I'd say I am.
I usually try to mumble it, so I get I get it both ways. Yeah. Yes. So it was the policy access analyzer. Is that what it was?
Policy simulator?
No. Policy simulator. That's it. I am policy simulator. So he did a talk about that. And then we also had Sandro Volpicella talk about GraphQL, specifically how to use it at Hashnode and their journey of evolving their API to what it is today without using AppSync, which in my opinion was actually a really refreshing talk to have a talk about GraphQL that doesn't involve AWS AppSync. So we have a couple of clips to kind of see this conversation. So let's start with Sam. Let's listen into what Sam had to say.
And so for people listening on the call, I'm sure that you probably have a similar situation. I know that I have deploying standards web applications on EC2 and RDS back in the past. RDS taking about 15 minutes to actually spin up. So that feedback loop for me was extremely slow, just to find out that maybe I hadn't given the permissions to pull down the RDS credentials from Secret Manager or something like that. And that's where I stumbled upon the IAM policy simulator. So before we dig into it, let me just break down what their approach was. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to solve that in a matter of seconds for them.
Yeah, so what Sam was talking about there at the end when he said what they were doing is he was dissecting a live stream that Andres and I did a few weeks prior, where we were working with AppRunner to basically do a clip generator from live streams. So we would build a transcript, pass that over to Gen AI and say, what are the best clips from this video? And we were having a lot of issues with the necessary permissions or transcribe and whatnot. And what we would do is we would basically update the role and then redeploy the entire app runner instance and wait for however long, 10 minutes, test it, see that it didn't work, and then do it again. And it took us like an hour to figure out what that policy was. So Sam took it on himself to do a session to say, here's everything that Alan and Andres did wrong, and here is how you would do it better. So what were your big takeaways from this session, James?
The IAM policy simulator exists. Like, genuinely, I did not even know it was a thing. And I mean, we've all been there, haven't we? Like, anyone working with, I mean, I was doing some stuff with Google Cloud last week, and I ran into the exact same issues where you deploy something, permissions are wrong, go and have a look at what permissions I need to change. So the fact that there's a tool you can use that, as I understood it, will actually load in the actual IAM users, IAM roles, IAM policies from your account, and then you can kind of manipulate them in a sandbox against an actual resource, test it against actual IAM policies, and kind of iterate in real time. So it doesn't ever write back to your AWS account. It won't go off and update your role, but it allows you to kind of iterate and move a lot quicker instead of needing to redeploy, wait, so on and so forth. That was kind of what I understood it as, and it seems really cool.
Yeah, agreed. I wish I had known that exists a long time ago. Now, normally, that using App Runner is not my normal development lifecycle. I usually use SAM and SAM Sync, and things just kind of update into the cloud as I'm writing them inside of VS Code, and the feedback loop is super, super fast. But for a lot of situations, like what Sam was describing in that clip we listened to, when you're deploying something into EC2 or into Fargate or into App Runner, that feedback loop is much, much slower. So being able to validate your roles and knowing what SDK calls you're making ahead of time can really speed that up.
Particularly with Fargate, like ECS Fargate. I don't know if you've ever come across this, but if you roll out a container and it fails to deploy, ECS retries, I think it's 12 times or 10 times. And there's no way to stop it. It just goes, and you just sit and wait, and it'll deploy your container, and you'll watch the logs, and the logs will go, doesn't have permissions to do, and then it'll fail, and then it'll go again, then it'll go again. Boom. If everybody's listening to this, I'm currently smacking my head on the mic in front of me. It's very frustrating.
But yeah, that was a really good talk, and I actually highly recommend watching the full one. I mean, we can talk about it, but it was there's a lot of value in actually watching the talk, because Sam goes into the AWS console and uses it and shows you exactly what you can do and what it does. Highly recommend. So the other video that we had was from Sandro talking about the Hashnode GraphQL journey. Now let's listen to what Sandro had to say.
And what we can see is that all of this data comes from different data sources. So the about content, for example, is simply saved in MongoDB. The drafts are saved in Firestore. The Pro subscription is saved in Stripe. And for example, our schedule draft are event-push schedules. And the cool thing with having these small resolvers, you can choose the data source where it's coming from and simply define a very small function to resolve these fields. And of course, this is also possible with REST.
If I had to have an elevator pitch for GraphQL, it's that right there. It's really emphasizing that single responsibility principle of small resolvers do one thing and get data from a variety of data sources.
Yeah,
and
combine really nice. It together, as I understand it. Like, you can actually manage it and combine it together, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's like everything that you know inside of enrichment pipelines, transformation pipelines, multiple API endpoints. It can all just be used inside of a pipeline to do one thing. Like you can pass in a mutation, which is, if you're familiar with REST, that's a write operation, like a post, where it's going in and saving data. And it can do a handful of things at a handful of different data sources with one call to your actual API, which is really cool. And conversely, gets are the same way. You can go and fetch data from a whole bunch of different data sources and really surface that just as a single endpoint inside of your GraphQL API.
Yeah, I mean, and I've never really used it in production, but it was really, I actually posted Sandro for that talk, and it was really interesting learning more. I think the big challenge I've always had with GraphQL is almost this exact thing we're just talking about. Like if you're allowing users to choose which bits of data they access, and you've got all these different resolvers going to all your different databases, how do you manage any kind like, how do you actually manage infrastructure or load, or like how do you know what people it's always struck me as being really interesting and really cool, but equally you're giving the users the potential to hit all these different data sources, combine it all back together. It could hit Mongo, it could not, it could hit Stripe, it could not. Like that's the one bit where I'm always like, does that seem like a good idea? I'm not sure.
It's good. I mean, it's good at the standpoint of it's super practical to use when you're building a front end, when you're using GraphQL, because it really gets rid of that overfetching problem. If you want to even consider it a problem these days, browsers have so much memory, it doesn't really matter if you're overfetching data. And just to make sure that everybody understands what I mean by overfetching, let's just say you're doing a get. Let's just do a REST example. You're doing a get on an item, and all you need is the status, but you do that get, and it brings you the status, the ID, all of the details, who did it, the audit information. It's basically a full load of that entity that you're bringing into the browser onto the client side. And you're just throwing away all that data. So you're using all that bandwidth for nothing. And then ultimately you're using some of that memory inside of the browser as well. With GraphQL, you can say, just give me the status from this call. You have a schema defined, and you can say, these are all the fields that I have available. You have the nested objects and whatnot, and I want X, Y, and Z properties. So it can pick and choose from that fully enriched object what it delivers back down to the client.
Yeah,
which is nice.
There was a heuristic I once read, and it was something along the lines of GraphQL is really good if you're building a front end. REST is really good if you're building for developers, and gRPC is very good for building like internal service to service communication. Like if you're building microservices, like HTTP microservices. And I was like, that kind of seems okay. I mean, I've never used GraphQL. I've used REST and gRPC, but that kind of makes sense especially with what you just said, like over the overfetching problem. That seems to make sense to me.
Yeah, I had a situation in the same warrant application I was talking about earlier, where we had a big step function workflow, and every now and then there would be a really bad guy that came in and just had tons of data, like a full rap sheet, just have been arrested multiple times, getting charged with 10 things, and it would overflow the step function state transition limit. And what ended up being the recommendation from our AWS TAM was just use GraphQL. Just fetch the data that you need and transfer that from state to state. You still have all of it saved in the database, but you're only using what you need for this translation or this enrichment, and you can pass that all the way down. It was an interesting thought. It was a really clever solution to that problem. So again, highly recommend that session. I'm going to say that every time we talk about a session and go over the highlights, because they're all good. They're all good. And these are coming from real world practitioners that are volunteering their time to create a presentation and come and talk. What I really like about what we're doing with this community is that we are giving the mic to the people that are doing the work. It's not what you're seeing in a lot of conferences these days, where it's a bunch of developer advocates going and giving the same talk in this state, in this state, in this country over and over and over again. There was a heated debate or a heated argument last week, 2 weeks ago, where it's just talking about conferences are now DAs talking to DAs, and it's becoming diluted with materials, but not with this community, because this is coming from the principal engineers, the senior devs, the business analysts, so the people that are actually putting in the work to make a difference in their companies, in their software, in the community. So really, really cool, super valuable talks.
Agreed. 100% agree.
Okay, so let's wrap this up, James. What do we have coming this week?
There are some really exciting things coming this week, actually. There's three events this week. Later on today, I believe, there's a fireside chat with Juan about using Gen AI. How can I not say that word? It's all over at the minute. There's a fireside chat with Juan about using generative AI in healthcare. We have Chris Price on Thursday talking about using gRPC in production. And then finally on Friday, I believe, Danielle is going to be trying out DigitalOcean functions, which I didn't even know existed until about an hour ago. So there we go. So yeah, there's some really exciting things coming this week. A good combination of generative AI, some modern stuff, gRPC, which has been around for a little while, and then things like DigitalOcean functions and trying out new things. So a really exciting week. Talks, I'll certainly be checking in for some of them. And yeah.
And then we'll talk about them next week on the podcast.
Yeah, we will. Cool.
Yes. So, last call to action. If you're listening to this podcast and you've never stepped foot in the Discord community, that's okay, but you should check it out. There's a lot of great conversation in there. There's interesting conversations wall to wall, just all different types of topics. And it's really not just serverless talk. It's really modern cloud application building. I almost said compute, but it's definitely not just about compute. It's about architecture. It's about data. It's about programming languages. It's about CI/CD. It's all these things that real world practitioners are doing and are super willing to share what they found that work and doesn't work. So go and check it out. It's really cool. Believeinserverless.com/community will take you straight there to the Discord channel, and you can go in and take a peek. Totally fine with lurking as well. Nothing wrong with lurking and getting your lessons from there. If you do join, I will call me or James or one of the other champions. We'll call out your name on the podcast next week. We'll welcome you, and we'll go from there. So thank you for listening. This has been a really fun episode, James. I had a really good time recording this, and I'm looking forward to. Yes, this is a lot of fun. So thank you guys again, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks. Bye.